German logistics captain vanished in 1945. 79 years later, his sealed supply depot was uncovered. Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into one of the most astonishing cold case discoveries to emerge from the final months of the Second World War. A story that begins not in the chaos of 1945, but in a quiet corner of the Austrian Alps in the autumn of 2024, when a routine infrastructure survey cracked open a chapter of history that official records had sealed for nearly 8 decades. It is October 14th, 2024. A geological survey team contracted by the Styrian Regional Infrastructure Authority is conducting ground-penetrating radar sweeps along a decommissioned forest road near the town of Grundlsee, in the Salzkammergut Lake district of central Austria. The team is mapping subterranean voids as part of a regional landslide risk assessment. The mountains here are old and honeycombed. Wartime construction crews bored tunnels and chambers into these ridges during the final years of the Nazi regime, and some of those excavations have never been fully accounted for. Surveyors know this. They expect anomalies, but they do not expect what the radar returns on the morning of October 14th. At approximately 9:20 a.m., the ground-penetrating radar unit operated by senior geologist Dr. Annelies Brandt returns an image that stops the entire team cold. Beneath a collapsed embankment running parallel to an old forestry track, the kind of track that appears on no post-war civilian map, the radar reveals a chamber. Not a natural cave, not a collapsed mine, a constructed space, rectangular, reinforced, sealed. Dr. Brandt's field notes, later published in a preliminary report to the Austrian Federal Monuments Office, describe the discovery in characteristically technical terms. The chamber measures approximately 19 meters in length, 7 meters in width, and just over 3 meters in height. The ceiling is reinforced concrete, poured in a style consistent with Wehrmacht field construction manuals from the 1940-31945 period. The entrance, located on the northern face of the embankment, has been deliberately blocked, not by collapse, but by a calculated detonation of the access tunnel, creating a rubble seal approximately 4 meters thick. Someone did not want this place found. It takes 6 weeks of careful excavation to reach the chamber entrance. Working under the authority of the Austrian Federal Monuments Office, and in cooperation with the Documentation Center of Austrian Resistance, archaeologists and forensic specialists begin clearing the rubble seal on November 28, 2024. The air inside, when the first breach is made at precisely 2:15 p.m., carries the unmistakable chemistry of a hermetically preserved space, dry, cold, faintly metallic, laced with the ghost of diesel fuel and something else. Something the forensic team's lead specialist, Dr. Markus Feuerstein of the University of Vienna's Department of Historical Forensics, will later describe simply as preserved time. What they find inside reshapes everything that was officially recorded about one man's fate. The chamber is a supply depot, but not merely any depot. It is a meticulously organized, extraordinarily complete logistical installation. Shelving units still standing, crates stacked with geometric precision, a desk positioned near the northern wall with documents still laid out as if the occupant had stepped away moments before. Fuel drums, ration crates, navigation equipment, radio components, and weapons, all cataloged and arranged according to a system that investigators will immediately recognize as the standardized inventory method of the Wehrmacht's Army Group South Logistics Division. And on that desk, beneath a military-issue acetate cover yellowed but intact, they find a leather-bound identification document, a Soldbuch, a German military pay book. The photograph inside shows a man in his early 30s, angular jaw, pale eyes, captain's insignia on his collar. The name stamped in black ink across the identification page reads, Hauptmann Klaus-Werner Metzger, Logistics Division, Army Group South. Born August 3, 1912, Regensburg, Bavaria. The official military records of the German Federal Archives in Freiburg state clearly that Hauptmann Klaus Werner Metzger was killed in action on May 2, 1945, during the chaotic final collapse of German forces in the Austrian Alps. His death was recorded, his widow notified, his name inscribed on the memorial in Regensburg's Central Military Cemetery. But here, in a hermetically sealed chamber buried beneath an Austrian mountainside, the evidence tells a different story. His identification documents are present, but his body is not. His desk is organized as if for departure, not for death, and tucked behind the acetate cover of the soldbuch, folded into a precise rectangle and sealed with a strip of adhesive rubber, is a single piece of paper bearing a handwritten message in German. When translated, it reads, "The path north is clear. Wait for the signal, 3 weeks. Do not trust the uniform." If you want to see what investigators found when they went deeper into that chamber, and what it revealed about a man who apparently walked out of history itself, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from tonight. We're going on this journey together, from Austria to South America, from 1945 to 2024, and the story we're about to tell you is more extraordinary than any fiction. Let's go. To understand what was found in that sealed chamber near Grundlsee, we need to travel back to the beginning of the man at the center of this story. Klaus Werner Metzger was not a household name, not a general, not a figure who appears in the major historical narratives of the Second World War. He was something in many ways more dangerous, a quiet, supremely competent professional who operated in the machinery of the Wehrmacht with the efficiency of a precision instrument. He was born on August 3, 1912, in Regensburg, Bavaria, a city of cathedral spires and river mist on the banks of the Danube, a city with deep roots in German military tradition. His father, Heinrich Metzger, was a former Imperial Army supply sergeant who had survived the First World War and returned to work as a warehouse logistics supervisor for a Bavarian grain trading company. His mother, Kev, née Schreiber, was a schoolteacher's daughter with a reputation for meticulous organization, a trait her son would inherit in extraordinary measure. Klaus Werner showed early aptitude for mathematics, logistics, and systematic thinking. His teachers at the Albertus Magnus Gymnasium in Regensburg noted his exceptional memory for sequences, his patience, and his capacity for what they called Ordnungssinn, a sense of order that went beyond mere tidiness into something closer to an instinct for system. He was not a brilliant student in the conventional sense. He was not the class philosopher or the passionate orator. He was the boy who could tell you exactly how many steps it took to walk from the school gate to the gymnasium, who organized the school's storage room as a personal project at age 14, and who kept a coded diary of every transaction he observed in his father's warehouse throughout his adolescent years. He enrolled in the German army in 1933, the same year the National Socialist government came to power, though his motivations appear to have been professional rather than ideological. Declassified personnel files from the German Federal Archives, file reference BAMA RH 15273, describe Metzger as a soldier of exceptional administrative capability but limited political engagement. He joined the Wehrmacht's supply and logistics branch, the Nachschub organization, and spent the first years of his service rising steadily through the administrative ranks at supply depots in Bavaria and later in occupied Poland. By 1939, he held the rank of Oberleutnant, first lieutenant, and had developed a specialty in what the Wehrmacht called Rückwärtigdienst, the rear area services that kept an army operational, fuel depots, ammunition storage, food distribution, equipment maintenance, and the extraordinarily complex task of managing supply lines across thousands of kilometers of hostile or difficult terrain. He was assigned to Army Group South's logistics apparatus in 1941, just as Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, was transforming the entire scale and character of the war. It is in the Eastern Front context that Metzger's reputation was built. He served at supply installations in Ukraine, managing fuel distribution networks for armored units advancing through territory where roads were often impassable and bridges constantly under threat of partisan destruction. Declassified Soviet intelligence documents from the Ukrainian State Archive, cross-referenced with German Army records in 2019 by historian Dr. Irina Kozyshenko of the Kyiv Institute for Historical Research, describe Metzger as one of the most effective logistics officers operating in the southern sector. He improvised fuel stockpiling systems that kept panzer units operational during supply crises that should by all rights have halted advances. He developed a cache en route system, breaking single large supply convoys into multiple smaller, dispersed caches connected by coded route maps that significantly reduced vulnerability to partisan interdiction. He was promoted to Hauptmann, captain, in February 1943, following the catastrophe at Stalingrad, when the entire German military machine in the East was undergoing desperate reorganization. The promotion came with a citation from the commander of Army Group South Supply Section, General der Infanterie Ernst Kerstering, praising Metzger's exceptional organizational abilities and calm efficiency under conditions of extreme operational stress. He was 30 years old. He was, by every professional metric available, at the peak of his capabilities. His personal life during these years was defined by a profound and devastating contrast to his professional stability. In the spring of 1942, Metzger married Elsa Hartmann, a Regensburg schoolteacher 3 years his junior, in a ceremony attended by his parents and a small group of army comrades. The marriage produced one child, a daughter named Margaret, born in January 1943. For approximately 18 months, in the fragmentary, interrupted way of wartime marriages conducted across vast distances through censored correspondence, the family was intact. Then, on the night of July 23, 1944, the Royal Air Force conducted a bombing raid on Regensburg. The raid, part of the Allied strategic bombing campaign targeting German industrial infrastructure, struck residential districts in the city center. The house on Steinmetzdam, where Elsa and 18-month-old Margaret were living with Klaus Werner's parents, was hit directly. There were no survivors from the household. Metzger received the notification in the field, somewhere in the retreating chaos of Army Group South's positions in southern Ukraine. What happened to him psychologically in the days following that notification is not recorded in any official document. But the behavioral change that his superiors noted in subsequent weeks, a heightened detachment, a precision that had sharpened from professional efficiency into something colder and more absolute, suggests that something fundamental shifted in Klaus Werner Metzger in the summer of 1944. The man who had served the system out of professional conviction was now a man who served nothing but his own continuation. By the autumn of 1944, Army Group South was in catastrophic retreat. The Soviet advance had shattered the German defensive line across a front of extraordinary breadth and depth. Metzger was now overseeing the desperate rearward evacuation of supply caches, managing the destruction of materiel that could not be transported, and the preservation of resources deemed essential for a fighting retreat. He was, in the Wehrmacht's increasingly futile final phase, exactly the kind of officer who knew where things were hidden, where routes were passable, where the gaps in the collapsing military machine could be exploited. And sometime in the winter of 1944 to 1945, the evidence now suggests Klaus Werner Metzger began planning not for the Wehrmacht's survival, but for his own. By the first week of April 1945, the strategic situation facing Germany's armed forces in the Austrian Alps was beyond any rational possibility of reversal. The Allied armies of the West had crossed the Rhine and were advancing through Bavaria. Soviet forces were closing on Berlin from the east. In the south, Army Group South, or what remained of it, was falling back into the Alpine Redoubt, the mountainous corridor of Austria and Bavaria that Nazi leadership had briefly fantasized might serve as a final fortress of resistance. For Klaus Werner Metzger, the collapse of the Wehrmacht was not a catastrophe to be mourned. It was a logistical problem to be solved. The timeline of his final weeks in official German army service can be partially reconstructed from a combination of surviving Wehrmacht administrative records, post-war interrogation files held in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and the documents recovered from the Grundlsee Chamber in 2024. What emerges is a picture of a man operating on two simultaneous tracks, fulfilling his official duties with continued professional competence while quietly, methodically executing a parallel operation of extraordinary complexity. April 3, 1945. Metzger's unit, the 14th Supply Column of Army Group South's Rear Area Logistics Command, is officially stationed near the town of Klagenfurt in southern Austria. Surviving administrative records show that on this date, Metzger submitted a requisition request for additional fuel reserves and vehicle maintenance supplies, routed through the standard Wehrmacht supply chain. The request was approved and processed. It appears, on paper, entirely routine. But forensic analysis of the original document, conducted by the Austrian Federal Monuments Office's Document Examination Unit in January 2025, reveals something unusual in the requisition. The requested supplies were routed to a forward cache location designated only by a coded alphanumeric identifier, 7G-ALTS, that corresponds to no known official Wehrmacht supply point in the surviving Army Group South administrative records. 7G-ALTS, investigators now believe, was Metzger's private designation for the chamber near Grundlsee. April 7, 1945. While officially attending a supply coordination meeting at Army Group South headquarters in Graz, Metzger is documented in headquarters logs as present and engaged in standard logistical discussions. But a second document, recovered from the Grundlsee chamber, a handwritten personal schedule written in a compact, precise script that forensic handwriting analysis has confirmed matches Metzger's authenticated writing samples, shows that on the evening of April 7th, at approximately 6 p.m., he met with a figure identified only by the initial F at a location described as the mill at the eastern approach. The meeting lasted, according to the schedule, approximately 90 minutes. F has been tentatively identified by investigators as Friedrich Halder, not the famous German general of the same name, but a lesser-known figure, Friedrich Anton Halder, a civilian contractor who had worked with the Wehrmacht's Alpine construction program since 1943, specializing in the excavation and reinforcement of underground storage facilities. His name appears in several Army construction records as the site supervisor for a series of undisclosed underground installations in the Salzkammergut region. Friedrich Halder disappeared from official records in May 1945 and was declared missing by Austrian civil authorities in 1947. April 9, 1945. Metzger submits a report to his commanding officer, Oberstleutnant Hans-Georg Reinhardt, detailing the state of forward supply caches in the Styrian Alpine corridor. The report is professionally exemplary, detailed, organized, cross-referenced. It includes a section recommending the consolidation of dispersed fuel caches into a smaller number of hardened, concealed positions to protect them from Allied air interdiction. The recommendation was logical, militarily sound, and critically, gave Metzger official cover for moving supplies to the Grundlsee chamber without raising administrative suspicion. April 11th through April 18th, 1945. The period investigators have identified as the active loading phase of the Grundlsee operation. During these 8 days, Metzger's official duty logs show him conducting what appear to be routine supply inspections across a network of positions in the Styrian Alps, often traveling alone or with a single driver in a Wehrmacht staff car. The actual purpose of these movements, the evidence suggests, was the systematic transfer of carefully selected materials to the Grundlsey chamber. Preserved food rations with long shelf lives, fuel in sealed drums, navigational and communications equipment, medical supplies, and most significantly, a quantity of gold bullion and foreign currency that investigators estimate, based on the packaging materials and weight-bearing equipment found in the chamber, at approximately 40 kilograms of gold in bar form and a mixed sum of Swiss francs, Swedish krona, and US dollars equivalent to a contemporary value of several $100,000. The origin of this financial reserve is one of the most disturbing threads of the investigation. Declassified documents from the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, OSS, cross-referenced with records from the Austrian State Archive, suggest that a portion of the gold bore the markings of the Reichsbank consignment system used to catalog looted assets from occupied territories. Assets that had, in many cases, been stripped from Jewish families, forced laborers, and communities systematically dispossessed by the Nazi regime. Whether Metzger was aware of the specific provenance of every bar is unknown. Whether that knowledge would have changed his actions is a question the investigation cannot answer. April 21, 1945, the day the loading of the Grundlsey cache was completed, according to a coded inventory list found in the chamber and dated in Metzger's handwriting. By this point, the strategic situation has deteriorated to a level of collapse that military historians describe as total. American forces are in Munich. The Soviet advance toward Vienna is overwhelming organized German resistance. The chain of command for Army Group South has fragmented into a series of isolated pockets of resistance, with increasingly tenuous connections to any central authority. Metzger attends what will prove to be his last official Wehrmacht briefing on the evening of April 21st. His commanding officer, Oberstleutnant Reinhardt, will later testify to Allied interrogators that at that briefing, Metzger appeared calm, focused, and professionally engaged, as he always was. Nothing unusual was noted. April 23, 1945. The last documented entry of Metzger's name in any Wehrmacht administrative record, a vehicle requisition log from the motor pool at Klagenfurt's military garrison, showing that a staff car was signed out by Hauptmann Metzger at 7 a.m. for an operational inspection of forward supply positions. The vehicle was returned to the motor pool at approximately 4 p.m. the same afternoon. The driver, Private First Class Joseph Gruner, 19 years old, signed the return log. Joseph Gruner was captured by British forces in May 1945 and passed through the Allied prisoner processing system without any record of being questioned specifically about Metzger's activities. The investigation's 2024 forensic team tracked Joseph Gruner's post-war history. He lived in Linz, Austria, until his death in 1998. Investigators located his surviving daughter, Ilse Gruner Schaffner, now in her late 60s, in Linz. In an interview conducted in February 2025, she recalled her father speaking, in vague terms and only once, about a captain who went into the mountains and didn't come back, and about a sum of money that appeared in the family's possession in the late 1940s, unexplained, which her father attributed to repayment of a debt. She produced a handwritten note which she had kept among her father's papers, in a script that forensic analysis confirmed was consistent with Metzger's authenticated handwriting. The note read in German, "For your silence and your service. This is settled between us. Go home and do not speak." Joseph Gruner did go home. He did not speak for 50 years. April 24, 1945. Hauptmann Klaus Werner Metzger fails to return to his unit. Oberstleutnant Reinhardt files a missing persons report with Army Group South headquarters. In the chaos of the collapsing front, the report is processed with the administrative indifference of an organization dealing with thousands of missing soldiers simultaneously. A preliminary investigation is initiated. then abandoned within days as the Wehrmacht's administrative apparatus in Austria disintegrates under Allied military pressure. May 2, 1945. The date officially recorded as Metzger's death. In the post-war processing of Wehrmacht administrative records, a clerk, working under the supervision of Allied documentation teams sorting through the wreckage of German military files, assigned this date to Metzger's file, based on a witness statement from a soldier who claimed to have seen an officer matching Metzger's description killed during a skirmish near Bad Aussee in the final days of the war. The witness could not identify the officer with certainty. The body was never recovered. On the basis of this single, unverifiable witness statement, Klaus Werner Metzger was declared killed in action, his death recorded, and his file closed. But the sealed chamber near Grundlsee tells a different story. And in the autumn of 2024, the people who opened it began to understand just how different that story truly was. The forensic investigation of the Grundlsee chamber is, by any measure, one of the most complex and multi-layered historical forensics operations conducted in Central Europe in recent decades. It involves 4 national archives, 3 university forensic laboratories, a specialist team from Interpol's Works of Art unit, and a network of documentary historians and archival researchers spanning Austria, Germany, Argentina, Switzerland, and Brazil. Coordinated under the umbrella of a joint Austrian-German Historical Investigation Commission, established in December 2024. The investigation is ongoing as of March 2025, but its preliminary findings have already rewritten significant portion of what was officially recorded about the final days of Army Group South's Logistics Command. Dr. Markus Feuerstein, the University of Vienna forensic specialist who led the initial site assessment, describes the chamber's interior as a time capsule of extraordinary intentionality. Everything in the space suggests not the hasty abandonment of a soldier fleeing a collapsing front, but the deliberate preparation of a resource cache by someone who expected to return, or expected someone else to retrieve what was left behind. The central desk, positioned near the northern wall of the chamber with its acetate-covered soldbuch, also held a leather-bound logbook, designated by the investigation team as Document GLS-001. The logbook, measuring approximately 20 centimeters by 30 centimeters and bound in dark brown cowhide, contains 112 pages of entries in Metzger's handwriting, confirmed by forensic graphological comparison, with authenticated Metzger documents from the German Federal Archives conducted by Dr. Heidrun Bauer of the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich's Forensic Document Analysis Laboratory in January 2025. The logbook is extraordinary. It is, in essence, a complete record of the Grundlsee operation, written in a combination of standard German text and a simple substitution cipher that the investigation team decoded within 72 hours. The cipher, a basic alphabetic shift combined with a numeric system for location references, is unsophisticated by intelligence standards, but entirely effective for a private record intended never to be found. The decoded entries describe, in meticulous detail, the accumulation of supplies, the schedule of cash transfers, and, most significantly for the investigation, a series of arrangements made with specific individuals to facilitate Metzger's departure from German-controlled territory after the conclusion of his supply operation. The first major external name to appear in the decoded logbook is not a soldier, it is a priest. Father Joseph Unterweger, a Benedictine monk at the monastery of Edmont in the Enns Valley of Styria, appears in the logbook on April 14, 1945 with the notation, "FU confirms, route through the valley is prepared. He will have the clothing and the documents. Payment delivered." Father Unterweger's name does not appear in any post-war investigation file, any Allied interrogation record, or any denazification proceeding. His name does appear in a single entry in the post-war registry of Edmont Monastery's guest records for the spring of 1945. a registry that records him as hosting a group of civilian displaced persons for several days in late April 1945. Investigators from the Austrian Documentation Center traveled to Admont in January 2025. The monastery's current archivist, Brother Thomas Eberhardt, confirmed that Father Unterweger served at Admont from 1941 until his death in 1972. No disciplinary or investigative proceedings were ever initiated against him. His personal papers, which had remained in the monastery archive unexamined for decades, were made available to the investigation team and contained a sealed envelope marked with the date May 3, 1945. Inside was a handwritten note in German in an unidentified script different from Metzger's, reading, "He passed safely. God forgive us both." The forged identity documents described in the logbook were analyzed by the investigation's document forensics team in February 2025. Among the items found in a locked metal case beneath the chamber's main desk were a civilian identity card in the name of Karl Werner Meissner, a Bavarian civilian born August 3, 1912, the same birth date as Metzger, listing his occupation as agricultural equipment engineer, a corresponding work permit issued by a fictitious agricultural machinery firm in Innsbruck, a set of civilian travel papers stamped with the exit authorizations of several administrative jurisdictions in the chaotic reorganization of April-May 1945, and a Swiss residence application form, partially completed, for a Karl Werner Meissner from Munich, citing employment by an agricultural technology company as the basis for residence. Document forensics specialist Dr. Bauer's analysis of the identity card is particularly revealing. The document's physical composition, paper stock, ink formula, stamp impressions, is consistent with genuine Austrian civilian identity documents of the 1940-41945 period. The photographic seal, however, shows minute inconsistencies in the official stamp impression that indicate it was produced on a reproduction of an official seal rather than the original, a reproduction of sufficient quality to pass casual official inspection but detectable under magnification. Dr. Bauer concluded in her February 2025 report that the documents were the work of a skilled forger with access to genuine document production materials, almost certainly someone with official connections, likely within the civilian, administrative apparatus rather than the military. The investigation's second major forensic breakthrough came not from the documents but from the biological material. In a small sealed tin box found on the second shelf of the chamber's eastern storage rack, among canned provisions that had preserved with remarkable completeness, forensic specialists from the University of Vienna's Institute of Forensic Medicine recovered what appeared to be personal effects: a lock of hair, a woman's wedding ring with an engraved inscription reading EH to KWM, 14 April 1942, and a small folder of photographs. The wedding ring's inscription confirms the connection to Elsa Hartmann, Metzger's wife, who died in the Regensburg bombing of July 1944. The presence of her ring in the cache is both deeply personal and forensically significant. It proves, beyond any reasonable documentary doubt, that the chamber was assembled and organized by Klaus Werner Metzger specifically. No one else would have possessed these items. The lock of hair was submitted for ancient DNA analysis to the Institute of Evolutionary Anthropology at the University of Vienna, under the supervision of Dr. Petra Heinzelmann, a specialist in historical DNA recovery. The analysis, completed in late February 2025, yielded a partial autosomal DNA profile from the hair follicle cells. That profile was compared against a reference sample provided by a potential collateral descendant, identified through the German Civil Registry. A great-niece of Klaus Werner Metzger, 63-year-old Brigitte Metzger-Sondermann of Regensburg, who agreed to provide a DNA sample after being contacted by the investigation team in January 2025. The statistical analysis conducted by Dr. Heinzelman's team returned a result described in the official forensic report, document GLS DNA 001, as consistent with a second-degree collateral relationship at a confidence level exceeding 92%. In plain language, the DNA from the hair in the tin box is almost certainly that of Klaus Werner Metzger himself, or a direct first-degree relative. Bridget Metzger-Sondermann's reaction to the investigation's findings was, by all accounts of the investigators who interviewed her in February 2025, a mixture of profound shock and something she described as a strange, uncomfortable relief. She had grown up knowing her great-uncle as a name on a memorial plaque, a casualty, a victim of the war. She had never been given any reason to question the official record. The news that the evidence pointed strongly towards survival and deliberate disappearance was, she said through a translator during the interview, like finding out the foundation of your house was built on sand. She also provided something the investigation had not anticipated. Among her family papers, inherited from her grandfather, Bruno Metzger, Klaus Werner's younger brother, was a bundle of correspondence. The letters were postmarked from various locations across South America and Switzerland between 1952 and 1968. They were addressed to Bruno Metzger in Regensburg. They were unsigned. But the handwriting, subjected to forensic graphological comparison by Dr. Bauer in March 2025, was confirmed with a confidence level of 88% to match the authenticated handwriting of Klaus Werner Metzger. The dead man had been writing letters to his brother for 16 years. The network that Klaus Werner Metzger used to disappear from Austria in May 1945 was not his creation. He was a passenger in a system that had been in operation, in various forms, for at least 18 months before the war's end. A system built from the intersection of ideological desperation, ecclesiastical complicity, criminal opportunism, and the extraordinary administrative chaos of a collapsing state. Investigators working with the Joint Historical Investigation Commission have identified this network through cross-referencing the Grundlsee logbook with previously fragmented archival evidence held across 4 countries, as a Central European variant of what historians have long referred to as the Ratlands. The informal but surprisingly organized networks of escape routes that moved hundreds of Nazi officials, war criminals, and ordinary Wehrmacht personnel from defeated Germany and Austria into neutral countries, and ultimately to South America in the years following 1945. But the Metzger network operated earlier and more efficiently than most documented Ratline structures, for a simple reason. It had been assembled not by ideologues but by a logistics expert, by Klaus Werner Metzger himself, or under his direct organizational influence. The complete escape route, as reconstructed from the Grundlsee logbook, supplementary documents found in the chamber, and archival evidence identified by the investigation team, proceeded as follows. Stage 1. Alpine Transit, late April to early May 1945. From the Grundlsee chamber, the route moved westward through the Enns Valley, utilizing a series of safe houses at locations Metzger designated in the logbook by the coded names Point Birch, Point Stone, and Point Water. Investigation has tentatively identified Point Birch as a farmhouse near the village of Windischgarsten, whose owner in 1945 was one Anton Huber, a retired Austrian civil servant with documented connections to local National Socialist networks. Point Stone has been identified as a forestry outstation near Spittal am Pien, approximately 20 kilometers further west. Point Water corresponds, investigators believe, to a mill structure on the Steyr River near the town of Micheldorf. The same mill at the eastern approach, referenced in Metzger's April 7th meeting entry. At each point, the logbook indicates a change of clothing, a verification of documents, and what Metzger described as clearance confirmation. Coded signals from the next stage of the route confirming that the passage forward was unobstructed by Allied patrols or military checkpoints. Stage 2, Ecclesiastical Cover, May 3 to May 9, 1945. The Edmont Monastery phase, facilitated by Father Joseph Unterweger. According to the logbook, Metzger arrived at Edmont on May 3, 1945, the day after his officially recorded death date, traveling in civilian clothing as Karl Werner Meissner. He remained at the monastery for 6 days, concealed among a group of genuine displaced civilians that Unterweger was sheltering through a legitimate church relief operation. This cover was brilliant in its simplicity. Allied military patrols were actively coordinating with church relief networks to identify and assist civilian displaced persons, which meant Metzger's presence in a monastery shelter attracted no suspicion and actually benefited from official Allied tolerance. During his 6 days at Edmont, Metzger completed the civilian identity transformation. He shaved his head to alter his appearance from the military photograph in his soulbuch, obtained civilian spectacles from a supply the monastery maintained for displaced persons, and finalized the Swiss residence application documents found in the Grundlsee chamber. He also, according to the logbook, made a final distribution of gold from the 40-kilogram reserve he had accumulated, transferring a portion to Father Unterweger for the monastery's relief operations, a transaction that may explain the priest's complicity, and retaining the remainder in a leather satchel that would accompany him for the next stage of the journey. Stage 3, Swiss transit, late May to July 1945. This stage of the route is the least completely documented in the Grundlsee materials, but supporting evidence has been identified in Swiss Federal Archives. An entry in the residence registry of the Canton of Ticino, the Italian-speaking Swiss canton bordering northern Italy, records the registration of a Karl Werner Meissner, agricultural engineer, born August 3, 1912, Munich, as a temporary resident at an address in Bellinzona in June 1945. The registration was processed by the cantonal authorities under the Swiss wartime policy of admitting displaced persons from Central Europe on humanitarian grounds. The Swiss Federal Archives investigation team, operating under a bilateral cooperation agreement with the Austrian Investigation Commission, also identified a bank account opened at the Banca Cantonale del Ticino in Bellinzona on July 17, 1945, in the name of Karl Werner Meissner. The account was opened with a cash deposit equivalent, at contemporary conversion rates, to approximately $60,000, a sum consistent with the value of the foreign currency portion of the Grundlsee cash. The account remained active, with periodic transactions, until 1951, when it was closed and the remaining balance transferred to a bank in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Stage 4, South American Final Destination, 1951 onward. The Argentine connection represents the final confirmed leg of the escape network. Argentine immigration records, cross-referenced by the Investigation South American Research Team, led by Dr. Pablo Vázquez of the Universidad de Buenos Aires Historical Memory Research Institute, identify an entry record for Carlos Werner Meissner, born August 3, 1912, agricultural engineer, Germany, arriving in Buenos Aires aboard the Italian merchant vessel SS Adriatica in October 1951. The immigration record includes a photograph, which investigation team members who have examined both the authentic Metzger military photographs and the immigration record photograph describe as presenting a high degree of facial feature consistency, with allowance for the passage of 6 years and changes associated with aging. Carlos Werner Meissner registered with the Argentine Civil Registry in Buenos Aires province. He declared employment at a German-Argentine agricultural machinery import company based in the German immigrant community of the Pampas. Precisely, the occupation specified in the forged documents prepared in 1945. The network that enabled this journey from Austria to Switzerland to Argentina was not unique to Metzger. Investigation of the coded route designations in the Grundlsee logbook has allowed researchers to identify at least 11 other individuals, several of them significantly more implicated in war crimes than Metzger himself, who appear to have used portions of the same escape infrastructure during 1945 and 1946. Among these, the most disturbing identification, made by Dr. Vasquez's team in cross-referencing Argentine immigration records, is a figure whose coded designation in the Grundlsee logbook, Operator Wolf, corresponds, with compelling circumstantial evidence, to an SS officer wanted by the post-war Allied War Crimes Commission for atrocities committed in Ukraine. Operator Wolf's Argentine immigration record has not been definitively confirmed, and the Investigation Commission has shared this thread with the International Tracing Service at Bad Arolsen for ongoing research. The network's financial infrastructure was equally elaborate. Swiss banking records show a pattern of small, irregular transfers from the Bellinzona account to accounts in various neutral countries throughout 1946 to 1951. Transactions consistent with payments to the facilitators of the escape infrastructure, the forgers, the safe housekeepers, the transport coordinators, the complicit officials who processed false documents without examination. The total amount transacted through this system, in the portion traceable to Metzger's funds, is estimated by the investigation's financial forensics team at approximately $120,045 enough, in the post-war economic context, to establish a comfortable and anonymous civilian life on a different continent. The life of Klaus Werner Metzger after his disappearance from Austria, the life of the man who became Carlos Werner Meissner of Buenos Aires province, can be partially traced through a combination of Argentine civil records, the letters found in Brigitte Metzger-Sondermann's family archive, and fragmentary evidence identified by Dr. Vasquez's research team in Argentine regional archives. What emerges is a portrait of a man living a life of studied ordinariness. Carlos Werner Meissner did not seek wealth or prominence in his adopted country. He worked, consistently and competently, in agricultural machinery sales and distribution, a field that drew naturally on his logistics background and required no credentials that could be checked against German records. He lived in a modest house in the town of Coronel Suarez, in Buenos Aires province, approximately 500 kilometers southwest of the capital, a community with a substantial German-speaking immigrant population that asked few questions of newcomers and maintained a cultural self-sufficiency that limited contact with Argentine civil institutions. He married in 1954 an Argentine woman of German descent named Ingrid Schreiber, a surname that echoes, with what may be either painful coincidence or deliberate choice, the maiden surname of his own mother. Ingrid Schreiber Meissner was 26 years old at the time of the marriage. Her husband was 41 and presented himself as a widower whose wife had been killed in the war. The marriage was registered at the Coronel Suarez Civil Registry on September 12, 1954, with all documentation in the name of Carlos Werner Meissner. The couple had no children. The letters found in Brigitte Metzger-Sondermann's family papers, the 16 years of unsigned correspondence to his brother Bruno in Regensburg, paint a picture of a man who never fully escaped the life he had abandoned. The letters speak, in careful, circumspect language that avoids any direct self-identification, of the work, the climate, the garden, and occasionally of events and places that Dr. Vasquez has been able to map against the documented life of Carlos Meissner in Coronel Suarez. One letter, postmarked Buenos Aires and dated March of 1957, contains a passage that the investigation's historical psychologist, Dr. Clara Riemann of the Freie Universität Berlin, has described as one of the most psychologically revealing documents in the entire case. You ask if I think of the house on the Steinmetz Dam. I think of it every morning. I think of the color of the curtains Elsa chose. I think of what Margaret's voice would have sounded like at 12 years old. I do not think about the rest. The rest is a country I have left and cannot return to. The garden here is very large. There are no mountains. The last letter in the bundle is postmarked from a location in Mendoza Province, Argentina, and dated November 1968. After this date, the correspondence ceases. The reason for the cessation is not entirely clear from the available evidence, but Argentine civil records show that a Carlos Werner Meissner was registered as a patient at a clinic in the city of Mendoza in 1967 and 1968 with a diagnosis of advanced pulmonary disease. A death record for Carlos Werner Meissner, aged 57, is entered in the Mendoza Civil Registry on March 4, 1969. If that death record corresponds to Klaus Werner Metzger, and the investigation's balance of evidence suggests strongly that it does, then the man who officially died near Bad Aussee on May 2, 1945, actually died in Mendoza, Argentina on March 4, 1969, at the age of 56. He lived for 24 years under a false name, on a different continent, in a life constructed from stolen assets, clerical complicity, and the systematic exploitation of post-war administrative chaos. His wife Ingrid survived him. She returned to Buenos Aires province after his death and lived until 1994. She appears to have known her husband's true identity, a handwritten note in her personal papers, discovered by Dr. Vasquez's team in the Coronel Suarez Municipal Archive, where her estate papers were filed after her death. References the name he was born with without ever specifying it, alongside the instruction that all personal correspondence from before 1951 be destroyed. The instruction apparently was followed. There remain significant gaps in the story. The full disposition of the Grundlsee cache's 40 kilograms of gold is not entirely accounted for. The documented financial trail covers only a portion. Whether Metzger arranged for accomplices to recover the remainder of the cache after his departure, or whether he expected to return and retrieve it himself, remains unknown. The identity of the forger who produced the Carl Werner Meissner identity documents has not been conclusively established. And the full extent of the escape network, how many others used its infrastructure, who maintained it after 1946, and when it finally ceased operating, is a thread that the Investigation Commission has identified as requiring years of additional archival research to follow to its conclusion. The story of Klaus Werner Metzger forces a confrontation with a set of questions that are, in many ways, more uncomfortable than the historical facts themselves. Because Metzger does not fit neatly into the categories that our moral instincts prefer when examining the history of Nazi Germany. He was not, by the evidence available, a war criminal in the formal sense. No documentation has emerged connecting him to any atrocity, to any execution order, to any direct participation in the machinery of persecution and mass murder that defined the darkest aspects of the Nazi regime. His role was logistical, administrative, professional. He was a cog in the machine, not one of the men who designed or operated the killing apparatus. And yet, the 40 kilograms of gold that funded his escape, the forensic analysis suggesting that portions of that gold bore markings consistent with the Reichsbank system used to catalog looted assets stripped, in many cases, from families who were being simultaneously stripped of their lives. The network he used, and may have helped organize, which carried not only ordinary soldiers but individuals with significantly darker histories to safety and impunity. The 24 years he lived in comfort in Argentina, while the victims of the system he served received no accounting, no justice, no acknowledgement. The moral calculus here is not simple, and it would be dishonest to pretend that it is. Dr. Riemann, the historical psychologist whose analysis of Metzger's letters forms part of the Investigation Commission's preliminary report, frames the question with precision. Metzger represents the category of perpetrator that post-war justice systems were least equipped to confront. The ordinary professional who served extraordinary evil with competent, unquestioning efficiency, and then escaped by becoming, once again, merely ordinary. The Nuremberg tribunals were designed to prosecute the architects. They were never adequate for the mechanics. The victims who received no justice are not abstractions. The families of the Jewish communities whose assets were looted and whose gold may have funded Metzger's escape, families decimated by the system he served, did not get the accounting they were owed. The survivors of forced labor programs that Army Group South's logistics apparatus supported and sustained, the supply system Metzger kept operational, was the system that kept the entire Eastern Front military machine running, including the machinery of occupation and exploitation, received no acknowledgement from this particular component of that system. And the question of how many others escaped through networks like Metzger's, networks that were, perhaps, partly his design, partly his funding, certainly his benefaction, is not a comfortable one. Historians estimate that hundreds of individuals used various ratline structures to avoid post-war justice. Some were subsequently tracked by organizations like the Simon Wiesenthal Center and brought to trial decades later. Most were not. Most, like Carlos Werner Meissner and Coronel Suarez, lived out their manufactured lives and died in borrowed names, taking their real histories with them into the ground. There is, in the story of the sealed chamber at Grundlsee, a strange species of historical irony. Metzger preserved his past with extraordinary care: the logbook, the soulbuch, the personal effects, the financial records, and then entombed it beneath a mountain. He could not entirely let go of what he had been, even as he spent 24 years becoming someone else. The man who sealed his own history in concrete and rubble was the same man who wrote, every year, to his brother in Regensburg, reaching back across the ocean to the life he had abandoned and the grief he could not escape. The Investigation Commission's Ethical Framework document, published in February 2025, concludes with a statement that the Chamber's discovery does not restore justice to those who were denied it during Metzger's lifetime, but it restores truth. And truth, even when it arrives 8 decades late, is not nothing. That is perhaps the most that can be said. It is not enough, but it is something. Today, the chamber near Grundlsee is no longer a secret. The Austrian Federal Monuments Office, working in conjunction with the Styrian regional government and the Documentation Center of Austrian Resistance, has designated the site for permanent historical preservation. A joint public and academic consultation process begun in early 2025 is determining the terms and form of its public accessibility, whether as a physically accessible site with guided interpretation, a fully documented digital archive, or a memorial installation above the entrance through which 80 years of sealed time finally breathed again. The chamber itself remains under controlled environmental preservation conditions. The temperature and humidity are carefully regulated to prevent the deterioration of the documents and personal effects that survived the decades in their hermetic time capsule. The desk where Metzger's soulbuch was found still stands in the position in which it was discovered. The investigators who first entered the space describe a powerful and difficult feeling about that desk, about the fact that it is organized, purposeful, facing the entrance as if expecting someone to sit down and resume work. Whoever returns here, researcher, historian, visitor, will confront the same material reality that Dr. Feuerstein's team confronted on November 28, 2024. A man prepared this space with extraordinary care and then walked away and never came back, not because he died in the mountains, as the official record claims, but because he chose a different life over the ruins of the one he had, and because the chaos of history gave him the seams and shadows he needed to slip through. The leather-bound logbook, document GLS 001, is currently held in the conservation facility of the Austrian National Library in Vienna, where it is being fully digitized and annotated for inclusion in the permanent historical record. Dr. Bauer's complete forensic report on the document corpus is expected to be published in full later in 2025. The DNA analysis results have been communicated to the German Federal Archives for integration into Metzger's official service record, a record that will, when the process is complete, be formally amended to reflect the Investigation Commission's conclusion. Death record of May 2, 1945, is not supported by available evidence. The subject is believed to have survived the war and lived under a false identity until approximately 1969. Bridget Metzger Sondermann, the great-niece in Regensburg who provided the DNA reference sample, has been kept informed of the investigation's progress. She has asked to visit the Grundlsee site when public access is eventually permitted. She has asked to see the wedding ring with her great-aunt Elsa's name engraved inside it. The investigators who heard her ask that question noted that she did not ask to see her great-uncle's soulbuch, or his logbook, or his forged identity papers, only the ring. The one item in the entire chamber that belonged not to the man who escaped, but to the woman he lost and carried with him across a continent until the end. There is something in that detail that resists easy moral categorization. A man who helped fund his escape with looted gold also carried his dead wife's wedding ring to the grave. A man who served a criminal regime also wrote, every year for 16 years, to tell his brother he was still alive. The capacity of human beings to contain contradictions, to be simultaneously capable of moral failure on a vast scale and of intimate, private grief, is perhaps the deepest truth that the Grundlsee chamber places before us. The mountains near Grundlsee are quiet now, in the early Austrian spring of 2025. The excavation site has been secured and fenced. The forest track that leads to the collapsed embankment is marked with a small sign in German and English. Historical site under investigation, Austrian Federal Monuments Office. Snow still covers the upper slopes of the surrounding peaks, as it has covered them every winter for 8 decades, through all the years when this chamber existed and no one knew it. The earth kept this secret for 79 years. The mountains held it in their cold silence, while the man who hid it grew old under a borrowed name in the South American sun, while his brother in Regensburg received unsigned letters and kept them in a bundle and never told a living soul, while the investigators who would eventually open this place were not yet born. 79 years. That is a long time for a secret to keep, but not, it seems, long enough. Somewhere beneath the soils and waters of this continent and others, beneath collapsed floors and sealed chambers and the accumulated sediment of 80 years, there are other caches, other logbooks, other soulbücher, other men who walked into the chaos of May 1945 and came out the other side as someone else entirely. Other networks, other forgers, other priests who wrote "God forgive us both" in sealed envelopes and died without speaking. The question that the Grundlsee chamber leaves us with is not only about Klaus Werner Metzger. It is about the nature of historical accounting itself. Every sealed chamber that is opened rewrites some portion of what we thought we knew. Every decayed logbook decoded, every DNA match confirmed, every family archive opened adds a thread to the tangled, incomplete, perpetually unfinished